Good evening, day walkers and night stalkers. It's me, your twisted southern horror queen, coming to you live from under full moon right here in southeastern Louisiana. Now I'm being brought to you live tonight and every Monday night by Armed Radio Digital and TuneIn Satellite, the only two networks with a set big enough to broadcast this madness right here over 62 different countries. And the man behind the scenes, my always awesome and sometimes sober producer, Jimmy Bell, over in Boston, Mass. He's got a show here on Armed Radio as well. It's called Pot Talk, and it airs on Thursday nights at the same time my show airs on Mondays. There's a lot of pot talk going on Jimmy's show. Y'all check it out sometime. It's pretty cool. You'll like it, I promise. So last week we talked about all the cool new friends I made over last month in Harlan County, Kentucky, and at Night Risers in E-Town, Kentucky, and of course all my friends at Gulf Coast Fan Fest. And there's one of those friends now, my boy, Freddie Roseman. It's going to be an awesome night. I'm drinking tonight, Freddie. Hang on. So first off, speaking of drinking, I got to give a shout out to our newest sponsor, Naked Wines. How fitting is that, y'all? Yeah, there's a new logo going on the Adrian's Fury trailer, that's for sure. And it already fits with our color scheme, so that's awesome. Their timing's perfect. I actually opened a bottle over the weekend for Big Johnny Blender's birthday dinner, and, you know, it was really good. We enjoyed it. And there's actually a little bit left over that's going to go along with this next segment. So if y'all will excuse me for just 1 second, I'm going to pop the cork on this Saints and Sinners bottle of wine, which is awesome because I've got some crazy good news to tell you. Let's see if the cork's actually going to work with me. I'm going to be really pissed if I can't get it out. I have to get my switchblade. There it goes. Nice. No, I'm not going to stick a straw in the bottle. I actually have a glass up here with me. The straw days are over. That's pretty right there. All right, so here's to you guys. I wish y'all were sitting up here with me. I'd pour a glass for you. Very nice. So, with all that being said, because you guys are tuning in live tonight, I'm going to tell you guys what's been going on behind the scenes. So y'all bear with me. There might be a little ranting actually going on. My girl Rhonda's in the house. How's everything going, sweetheart? I hear y'all are freezing your asses off up there. It might have hit 80 here today. Anyway, so in 2011, I wrote my first novel, To Be a Soulmate. That's volume 1 of the Adrian trilogy series. Now, for my first novel, the storyline was excellent. Readers were giving me fantastic feedback, and they were telling me they could actually see the story being played out in their mind while they're reading it. And that's the best compliment ever if you are an author, to know that your audience is actually able to see the things as you're describing them, the way they're supposed to be relayed. Now, you know, there were a few grammatical issues and definitely some formatting issues, but I self-published it and did the best that I could do with it and created enough buzz to be offered a few different publishing contracts within a month of me self-publishing. And of course, as you guys know, I actually signed one of those contracts. Well, at first everything was going pretty good and she was actually doing what she was supposed to be doing. And then a little while later, my book comes back out with the company logo on it. It was a freaking disaster. There were over 200 errors. She just absolutely destroyed my work. And it pretty much went downhill ever since then. But her half-assed work and the things she overpromised and underdelivered, and out of all of her shortcomings for 5 years, I actually learned to do the things that she screwed up or just absolutely didn't do at all. So during my contract with her for the entire Adrian trilogy series, I self-published Short and Gory and Wicked Truth, and my next novel, number 6, The Legend of the Dark Man. Stay tuned for announcements on that. That's coming out next year. I'm trying to figure out a date now, but you know, I'll get there at some point, and I'll let you guys know as soon as I figure that out. Hey, Mike, nice to see you tonight. Carolyn Rossi's in the house. Hello, my love. I hope you're doing well. So anyway, my bullshit contract with my bullshit publisher is actually dead in February. However, we had a brief discussion over the weekend, and there will be an early termination, much to my elation. Volume 1, To Be a Soulmate, which is now going to be retitled Soulmate in its 3rd edition, is complete, and it is waiting for new cover art. It's going to be released sometime in the 1st quarter of next year. I'm in the middle of working on Volume 2. Now, the storyline's still the same, but it's just more fine-tuned, and it's a little more visual for the readers. So if you haven't read the trilogy, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. But the one thing that I did want to say is it was the first novel I wrote. And in the past 5 years, my writing style has developed. It's evolved. Sometimes I actually surprise myself. So I'm going back and just kind of fluffing it. And it was a really good read to start with. And now it's going to be an awesome read. So anyway, about the Adrian trilogy series. The main character, Adrian, is this modern-day businesswoman in Louisiana, and she was born with a veil. So for you guys out there that have no idea what that means, when you hear someone say they were born with a veil, that means that they actually are gifted. They see things, they dream, and they sense things. So Adrian's had this one dream in particular since she was a kid, but it was different from all the other ones where she actually saw things happen and was able to forewarn folks before the shit hit the fan. But she would dream about this couple, and it always felt like she was standing directly behind them. And in one scene, they were happy and everything was good. And then the next scene, everything would just go black, and she'd be overwhelmed by this overbearing sense of dread and loss. And this looming sense of mourning would follow her around for days after she actually had this dream. Now, the other main character is Christian. For me to tell you about him, we got to go way back in time. I'm talking way back. Christian was the eldest son of a sitting king who spent most of his time in the battlefield out fighting alongside of his father's army. Well, one day the king hits him with this whole arranged marriage thing, and Christian wasn't really having it. So he convinces his old man to let him have one more tour before he had to marry whoever this chick was that he'd picked out for him. So Christian heads south with the king's army, and he runs across this chick, Cassandra. Well, long story short, he falls in love with her, and of course she falls in love with him too. And a few weeks later, he's decided he's going to marry her. Well, his old man would be really pissed off because he's already picked out some chick for him to marry. So he decides that he's going to come clean. He's going to tell Cassandra all about what was going on. Well, come to find out, Cassandra figured out that she was actually the chick that Christian's father had picked for him to marry. But her father wasn't having any of that. So they're young and they're in love, and they did what they wanted to do anyway, and then they got the hell out of Dodge. Well, their old man goes apeshit, and he sends his army after him. Well, they found him, and they attacked, and come to find out, Cassandra actually took the blade for Christian to save his life. Well, Christian comes unbolted, and he goes on this vicious, bloodthirsty quest to kill every one of the king's men and every surviving member of their family. He was leaving a trail of corpses behind him a mile wide. In fact, he was raising so much hell down here on earth that he caught the attention of the gods. So this deity comes down, and she starts counseling with him, and she's asking him to stop all the bloodshed. Well, that pissed him off. So in turn, he pisses off the deity, and she curses him to walk the earth in darkness for eternity, and then she gives him the thirst for blood. Now, you guys are going to have to read the books if you haven't already to see how all of that madness comes together. But be on the lookout for some official announcements coming up after the holidays. It's the Adrian trilogy revamped. All right, let's see who else is in the house. Big boss man Joe Savino's in the house, and there's Ronnie and Lori Owens and my girl TC. What's happening, sweetness? All right, So tonight, I've got a little shameless self-promotion out of the way, and now it's that time. It's the time where I tell you to dim the lights, kick out the kids, lock the door, and grab a tasty adult beverage, because it's time to get your scary on. Now, tonight, I have some crazy-ass gravestone stories lined up for you. I actually have one of my own that I want to tell you guys about real quick. I talked about this before, but for the new listeners, I think it's worth a quick redo. So my mom was a genealogist when I was growing up. Not gynecologist, genealogist. That's somebody that looks up family lines and traces them back in history. Well, she was doing all this madness back in the 70s and 80s. And of course, there was no Google back then and no Ancestry.com. So we spent merciless hours in libraries and old graveyards doing sketches or etches of old tombstones for her to do her research. It's starting to form a picture of my childhood now. So anyway, one weekend we go off into the middle of East Jesus and we pull off on what may have been a road at some time. And we're going there to look for this old cemetery that somebody told my mother about. So we get out of the car in the middle of the woods and we start walking around. And after a little while, we actually found this old graveyard. I was like 8 years old. And I still remember this headstone. You guys, grab a pen. I'll wait right here. No, write it on your hands. Go get some paper. Get something to write on. Grab a pen. I'm waiting for you, but hurry up. Okay. You got it? Cool. All right. So let me tell you about this gravestone. Now, I want to tell you up front, like I've told you before, my memory's for shit. I was 8 years old, and I still remember this. The headstone said, "Beware, you strangers, as ye pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, soon you will be. So prepare for death and follow me." Yeah, I think it could have scarred me just a tad, because I still remember that. Stacy's in the house. Trent's in the house. Mary's in the house. Geez, everybody's joining in tonight. Hey, Charles, good to see you, my friend. All right, so anyway, enough about my childhood traumas. Check out this madness. Now, we all know that behind every grave, there's a story waiting to be told. Now, most of these stories are glowing memoirs represented by elaborate carvings and headstones. Blessed mother, wonderful father, excellent son or daughter, and on and on and on. I know where that headstone is. Trent, I bet you do. You're not too far from it. I remember it was in that direction, but that's about it. And I remember what the stone said. That's cool that you know that, though. You're probably like the only person on the planet other than me. So anyway, some of these graves have some pretty crazy-ass stories associated with them. Have you ever heard of the Black Angel Monument? That's one of those tales right there. Legends say that it haunts Iowa's Oakland Cemetery. Now, locals say that the Black Angel has the power to kill anybody that touches or kisses it. Now, I don't know why the hell you'd want to kiss a headstone, but okay, apparently it doesn't like it, so don't do that. But let me tell you about the legend going on right here. This angel is a menacing 8-foot bronze statue that some folks said turned black overnight. But the reason why varies with each different version of the legend that you hear. Some folks say it got struck by lightning, and some folks said it was like a karma thing because the person that it was marking was apparently an infidel. Whatever. Anyway, there's another legend that says the woman that put it there was actually a witch. But whatever the reason is, the shadow that this Black Angel monument casts across the cemetery will send an Arctic chill up your spine. Now, history says that in 1912, Teresa Dolfel-Felvert commissioned this monument in memory of her son and husband, who both died before her. Now, their ashes are marked by the angel, which at that time was bright and shiny. But after Teresa's ashes were buried there in 1924, Folks say that that angel started turning black. It started at the crest of her head and then worked its way down to her feet. There's a couple of creepy stories about the black angel. One's about this chick that went to go and check it out one evening under a full moon. They said that she leaned over and kissed her feet. Well, folks said that she also dropped dead about 6 months later. Another story was about a skeptic that visited the statue with a group of friends, and he's all like, I don't believe in all that bullshit and everything. So his friends, of course, dared him to touch the statue, and he did. Idiot! So he dies on the spot with a massive heart attack. Now, there's some other morbid stories about pregnant women and things that happen to them after they've walked beneath the black angel's wings, but we're not going to go there tonight. So for obvious reasons, there have been countless paranormal investigations that have occurred there at Oakland Cemetery. And a lot of these folks have actually encountered and captured some crazy stuff going on around the Black Angel. Some of these folks walked away with interesting recordings of ghostly voices and other misty figures and shifting shadows that have been photographed there, along with some creepy looking light anomalies. Hey, Johnny Alfonso, what's happening, my man? And there's Charles Cardinello in the house too. Good God, I've got an awesome following tonight. So anyway, a few years back, Devin Marvel and Jael DePardo from Sci-Fi Channel's Haunted Highway, they go out to the cemetery and they start performing their own investigation too. Now, nobody there with that group touched the statue, but they did manage to capture a whole bunch of stuff on film. And one of the craziest things they caught was temperature fluctuations of the angel. As they started doing their investigation, of course, they're documenting everything with a video camera. Well, the temperature of the angel was the same as the temperature out in the graveyard. Mind you guys, it was freezing cold. There was snow and ice everywhere. The longer this investigation took place, the higher the temperature of the angel began to rise. Tell me that's not some madness right there. So that's pretty cool. I like the fact that it's been documented. And of course, like I said, there's been a whole lot of other investigations concerning the Black Angel Monument. But I've got more lined up for you tonight. So we're going to move on. Here's the next one. Now, this chick named Mary Ellis moved to New Brunswick in the 1790s to go live with her sister and her husband. Eventually, she bought her own house, which is now on Livingston Avenue. It's still there today. The story goes that Mary met up with this sea captain and they immediately fell in love. Well, one day he turns around and he has to go back off to sea. So he leaves Mary with the promise that he was coming back really soon. He actually even left his horse with her to take care of because he was coming back right there. He'd need his horse. Well, every day Mary went out to this river and she stood on the banks and watched for this dude to come back. Days and weeks rolled by, and of course, followed by years. Mary actually starts having to bury her relatives along with the captain's horse right there on her property. And eventually, in 1828, she was also buried in the family plot that overlooked the Raritan River. So they buried her there so she could keep watching out for her lover to return. She didn't actually need to be buried there, though. There's reports ongoing as recent as 2016 where she was photographed right there on the banks of the Raritan River with her hand shading her eyes as she's looking down the river, watching for her lost love, the captain, to come back to her. That's very sweet and chilling, and I'd actually like to see that one day. Now, this one's kind of crazy too, and it sounds like something that could have went down back in Mississippi where I grew up. So County Road 400 in Indiana has a weird little attraction these days. If you're planning a trip out that way, plan your route along this road because you're going to have a creepy little detour around the grave of Nancy Barrett. She had some strong-willed relatives that refused to have her grave disturbed when the county decided they were going to put a road right there where her plot was. Now, when I say refused, I mean like redneck justice. These family members were sitting in shifts all night long at this grave, making sure that nobody messed with it and the county workers couldn't get anywhere near it. Of course, they were armed. Now, after a tense standoff with the county, they finally gave up and they wound up splitting the road around her grave. And it's still like that to this day. But wait, it gets better. What had become a tourist landmark has taken on an even more mysterious air these days. For some reason, God knows why, archaeologists have actually recently exhumed the grave. They found a total of at least 6 people, 2 of them women, and one of them, of course, is suspected to be Miss Barrett. There were also 4 children and 2 other men, or 1 other man, whose identities are unknown. Now, besides the remains of whoever the hell was in that grave, there's a hell-bent ghost that still lingers there. There are people still reporting today that they've been threatened by a man in overalls with a rifle as they drove by the grave. Gotta love that sense of family unity, right? Let's see. Oh, my girl, Wayla is in the house. And there's April. Good to see you, girl. So then there's also this freaky little tale. It's called The Victim of the Beast. Now, just kind of caught my eye, but not a whole lot of backstory there. But at a glance, the grave of Lily E. Gray in Salt Lake City looks like just a regular grave. Yet beneath her name and date of birth and death, there's a sinister inscription that reads, Victim of the Beast, 666. Now, you'd think with some madness like that etched into your tombstone, there's got to be some wicked-ass story behind that, right? Not that I could find, but there are a few eye-raising theories, so I thought it was interesting enough to run by you guys tonight. Now, some folks think that Lily might have died in a car wreck on Highway 666, which does run through Utah. This highway was famous not only for its name, but because a high rate of fatal accidents was happening on these rural stretches of the road. During this time, Lily actually did live in Utah, and she could have easily traveled on that highway. So this theory does have a little plausibility to it. Now, another theory suggests that Lily was somehow involved with Aleister Crowley's cult from Salt Lake City. For those of you who thought that Aleister Crowley was just some drug-fueled hallucination of Ozzy Osbourne, no. Crowley was actually a notorious occultist in the first part of the 20th century. This dude actually referred to himself as the Beast. Yeah, some folks think she may have fallen victim to one of Mr. Crowley's macabre rituals or something. Could have happened. But one of the most intriguing and possible theories involves her husband, Elmer. Now, Elmer was thrown the hell off. Everybody knew in town that his ass was crazy. There's actually records of him getting in a fight because he was arrested in Ogden for stealing an umbrella. Old boy had a serious problem with the system, and maybe somehow in his demented little mind, he blamed the government for his wife's death, and that's how he expressed it on her tombstone. Anyway, here's another crazy grave story about the Jewett City vampires. Now, in Old Jewett City Cemetery of Griswold, Connecticut, you can still find a line of nondescript tombstones dating from the 1840s and 50s. They're really not a whole lot to look at, but these tombstones represent an era of panic and bloodshed. When the people think of early New England, one of the first things that comes to mind is New England clam chowder, right? A close second is always the infamous witch trials of the 17th century, and then, of course, the famous vampire epidemics. Historical documents written by those early residents indicates that during that dark time in history, folks believed in and feared the supernatural. Not only were there witches to be worrying about, but there were bloodthirsty creatures lurking about behind every damn tree there was. This general consensus in regard to the supernatural was so deep-rooted and powerful that nearly 200 years after the last supposed witch was hanged, people were still paranoid enough to believe that they could be overcome by vampires. Now, back in the day, there wasn't no Eric Northman or Lestat vampires. These bloodsuckers were gruesome, zombie-like undead. they were looking for lunch, and most typically in the form of their surviving family members. Well, in the case of the old Jewett City Cemetery, the family was the Rays, who over the course of 9 years lost multiple family members due to consumption, which is now known as TB. The first one to die from this mysterious disease was a 24-year-old son, Lemuel, in 1845. Less than 4 years later, the father bit it, and then he was joined by his 26-year-old son, Elisha, only 2 years after. Now, in 1854, the oldest son, Henry, starts coming down with all the same symptoms, and this is when the mass panic set in. Now, they're all convinced that they're dealing with something way beyond some wretched disease. The family came to the conclusion that the illnesses were being caused by their dead relatives rising from the grave at night and sucking on the blood of the living and remaining relatives. Something drastic needed to be done, right? Well, according to the old newspaper articles, the decomposing bodies of Lemuel and Elisha were dug up and burned immediately. Although it appears the body of Joseph Sr. was spared, it was believed by burning the parents he'd be rid of his affliction. But that wasn't the end of it. Some other evidence was discovered in the late 1990s that there may have been another earlier suspected vampire outside of the Ray family. In a neighboring town of Hopeville, 29 graves were unearthed. It was the unmarked cemetery of the Walton family. Hey, Jim Bob! Anyway, they lived about 2 miles up from the Ray's farm about 50 years earlier. That was somewhere around the 18th century. Well, upon archaeological exhumation, it was determined that one of the bodies, which had been decimated by consumption, apparently had been dug up after it was buried. Its head was removed, and what was left of the skeleton was buried face down with its femur bones crossed over its chest. Other than the Walton family members, it also evidently died from consumption. Consumption or vampirism, we may never really know. I see Keith Smith and Miss Janelle Hopkins in the house. It's good to see both of you guys this evening. And then there's one last freaky grave story. I hope you guys are ready for this. The moving caskets of the Chase Vault. Yeah, we talked about this legend a little while back, but we have a whole lot new listeners now, and I think they'd probably enjoy hearing the story as well. So we're about to dive straight into the Chase Vault. Now, that is on the island of Barbados. There's a little place called Christ Church Parish. It's just a regular run-of-the-mill church with a peaceful little cemetery sitting off to the side. But there's one tomb in this cemetery that's anything but peaceful. It's called the Chase Vault, and it's the center of one of the island of Barbados' most chilling and sinister mysteries. The vault was first built by Honorable James Elliot. Now, Elliot spared no expense, and this tomb was made quite elaborately. It was carved stone and coral, and the concrete walls were over 2 feet thick. And at the entrance was this enormous slab of blue marble that was intended to seal the tomb in place. Well, the first occupant was James Elliot's wife, Elizabeth, who died on May 14th in 1792. A few years later, the vault was purchased by the Walron family and was opened to receive the body of Mrs. Thomasina Goddard. However, upon removing the marble slab from the entrance, workers were surprised to find that the tomb was empty. Mrs. Elliot and her coffin had both completely disappeared. Well, the vault eventually ends up in the possession of the Chase family. The first member of the family to be buried there was a baby, Mary Ann Marie Chase, who died at the age of 2 on February 22nd in 1808. Her small lead coffin was placed in the vault, and the marble slab was put in place where it would remain for the next 4 years. Well, in 1812, Mary Ann's older sister, Dorcas, died under what some say were some very mysterious circumstances. The rumor was that she was being abused by her father, Colonel Thomas Chase. Now, this dude did have a reputation for beating his slaves and being unusually cruel and sadistic to his family. And some folks say that Dorcas refused to live under the tormentful conditions that she was in any longer, and she starved herself to death. So her coffin was added to the vault. Now, only a month later, the colonel commits suicide. Well, when the pallbearers opened the vault, they nearly pissed their pants. Inside the tomb, both of these little girls' coffins had seemingly been slammed around, and they were laying haphazardly on the floor. One of the coffins was actually upside down. So at first, everybody thought that the tomb had been ransacked by grave robbers. Well, there wasn't anything in there to steal, and nothing was missing, plus the fact that this massive marble stone at the entrance had never been moved. The seal was still unbroken. Now, despite the mystery, the two coffins were straightened up, and the body of Colonel Chase was added to the vault. The Chase vault was sealed again. 4 years later, the Chase vault was opened again to house the body of an 11-year-old named Charles Brewster Ames. Again, inside the tomb, the coffins looked like they'd been slung around, even the 240-pound lead coffin of the colonel's. Well, by now, the story's starting to spread all around the island. 52 days later, when Samuel Brewster was due to be buried, the vault was inspected from outside for anything out of the ordinary. The vault was found to be sealed airtight and watertight. Nothing could get in or out. But when they opened the tomb, it looked like a twister had hit it. By this time, of course, all the coffins were out of place, except for one, the wooden coffin of Thomasina Goddard. However, it had sustained some pretty heavy damage from another coffin supposedly smashing into it, and Mrs. Goddard's skeleton was now hanging outside of her coffin. Well, by this time, the news of the moving coffins had reached the ears of Barbados Governor Lord Combermere, who decided that he'd heard about enough of all this bullshit, so he was going to figure it all out himself. So he shows up and he decides he's going to have the vault inspected, and he's making sure that it was all impenetrable from the outside. Well, once he was satisfied with that, he decided that the vault should be open and sand sprinkled on the floor so that if any intruders were to have gotten in, they would surely leave some footprints behind. Finally, he has his seal placed into the fresh cement of the vault seal, because what intruder would dare to break his seal, right? Right. So Lord Combermere decided that he was going to leave the vault undisturbed, at least on the outside. So for 2 years, people are visiting this vault, and they were curious to see what was going on. Well, nothing ever changed with the exterior of the vault. However, many of the people who were, I guess, brave enough to go and check it out and stay for a while were reporting that they were hearing some wild stuff going on inside this tomb. Well, Lord Combermere decides he's going to open the vault up again and find out what the hell's been going on. So this time he shows up with 8 slaves, a big group of able-bodied men, and 2 masons, and of course there were hundreds of onlookers because they wanted to see what was happening too. Well, Lord Combermere ordered an inspection of the vault from the outside, and again nothing was out of the ordinary and none of the seals were broken. So the marble slab was removed, and Lord Combermere's knees got real weak real fast. The coffins had been violently flung around on the inside of the vault. One of them was actually leaning up against the door, making it very difficult to get into the vault to begin with. Mariana's lead coffin had been thrown so violently that a piece had actually chipped off of it. There, of course, were no prints in the sand, and nobody had entered the vault. Well, by this time, the Chase family was done. They had all of their bodies exhumed, and the coffins were moved and reinterred to another nearby tomb. Now, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you know, the Sherlock Holmes dude? Yeah, him. He was all into this mystery, too. He started proposing that the disturbances were being caused by Dorcas and Thomas, who committed suicide, and therefore they were cursed and restless. Well, the fact that the coffins had started moving only after Dorcas Chase was buried seemed to support his theory. There were other explanations offered, of course, such as human tampering, earthquakes, explosions, but those were all ruled out. Explosions and earthquakes would have disturbed the other vaults in the cemetery, and human tampering was kicked out due to the fact that the vault seal hadn't been broken on any of these occasions. The marble slab itself was so heavy, it took 8 men to move it. And then the coffin blocking the door would have made escape for any human intruder absolutely impossible. Well, the most popular theory, other than the supernatural ones, was flooding. If the vault had filled with water, the coffins, even the metal ones, would have floated. But if the coffin movement was caused by floodwaters, why wasn't the sand on the floor disturbed? How could it account for the damage done to the coffins like they'd been thrown around by some great force? And why hadn't the other vaults in the cemetery flooded as well? Some questions will never be answered. All right, so I think we've covered enough freaky grave legends for the evening, so let's switch gears and talk about some crazy haunted prisons and the legends behind those. We're going to kick it off with the Eastern State Penitentiary. Pennsylvania Quakers, who are a truly twisted bunch, founded this correctional facility in 1829. This was one of the first facilities that separated its inmates, and a lot of folks actually thought it was a bit too humane for the prisoners that were there. But in reality, the shit that went down behind Eastern State's iron bars was far from humane. Torture was a common means of reform here, and the prisoners were dunked in water and hung out to freeze in the dead of winter. Another reform tactic used was strapping prisoners to a chair for days on end, which drove many of these inmates further into insanity. But the most disturbing part of the whole system here was the iron gag. This wicked little device was used to clamp down onto the inmate's tongue, and then it was fastened to his bound wrist, so that any movement the inmate made, it ripped the flesh from his tongue. Wouldn't that make an awesome party favor? Anyway, so needless to say, there's a whole lot of these disgruntled inmates that are still hanging around this joint today. And one of the most famous of them all is, of course, the ghost of Al Capone. Now, from 1929 to 1930, Capone served a mere 8 months for carrying a concealed and deadly weapon. His cell was the nicest in Eastern State. It included a desk, a lamp, some paintings, and a cabinet radio. But the entire time he was there, he was complaining that he was being haunted by the entity of James Clark. That was one of the victims from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago. Now, this massacre was a result of gang rivalry, and Capone was leading one side of it. Even though Capone only spent 8 months of his life there, it's said that solitary confinement was one of the final straws that just flung him further into insanity. And of course, the syphilis was kicking by then too. So old boy was just slap mad by 1930. But I do think it says a lot that he comes back to haunt the joint, don't it? So Capone's not the only ghost that hangs out there. This joint is a hotbed for paranormal investigators who have captured full-bodied anomalies, voices, and a plethora of other haunted occurrences. I actually ran across this one little story too. There's this locksmith that was doing some restoration work in cell block 4. According to his story, he was trying to remove a 140-year-old lock from the cell door when this massive force overcomes him. He was paralyzed and he was forced to stand there and experience the horror that came with it. So he believes that when he removed the key, that it actually opened some portal to a horrific past, and it was offering the spirits that was caught behind its bars a pathway out. He describes what happened next as an out-of-body type of experience. He said he was drawn to this negative energy as it came bursting through the cell. He said he saw these anguished faces on the cell wall and hundreds of distorted forms swirling around the cell block, and one dominating entity that seemed to be calling the locksmith to it. This dude's experience was so vivid that for years after, he'd still shudder in fear when he talked about it. Today, the crumbling prison currently operates as a museum, which transfers once a year into a haunted house every Halloween. That'd be one hell of a haunted house to go visit right there, I would think. I don't know if I'll make my way over there that way in 18, but hopefully sometime in the nearby future, that would be a good little road trip to take. Next up, Alcatraz. So Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary is located on a craggy little island in San Francisco Bay, and it housed some of the deadliest and most sadistic convicts in American history, including Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, James Whitey Bulger, and a whole other list of deviants as well. The isolation of the rock took its toll on a lot of these inmates, and a lot of them resorted to murder or suicide, or just flat out went insane before the joint closed in 1963. Well, today the National Park Service tends to the prison, and there's a lot of park rangers that are constantly reporting hearing loud sobbing and mind-racking screams, along with the sounds of some really strange music. All right, so if you're into ghosts and ghoulies, you already knew all that. But here's something I bet you didn't know. Alcatraz was damned from the get-go. There are archaeologists that have found old native artifacts and bones buried deep in the ground of Alcatraz Island. They say that these artifacts indicate that the island was more than likely used by the Ohlone tribe as a burial ground for the tribe's outcasts. Fantastic! What better spot to house some of the most sinister deviants of the time, right? Of course, you know that notorious Al Capone is one of the main ghosts that's here. He actually wound up serving a total of 11 years in Alcatraz, with at least 3 stretches down in the hole, which was an utter place of horror, even for the baddest of the bad, I would suppose. There were no privileges that were allowed in this prison, and talking wasn't even permitted unless it was during a designated time. But musical instruments were allowed, and Al had a banjo that he played hours on end. Hey, Belinda, how you doing, sweetness? So a lot of the rangers and visitors have actually heard this banjo in the showers, and as they walk through them, they feel a cold spot. His cell door is known to open and close on its own, as well as there was this one visitor that reported once he turned to walk out of the cell that he felt a cold hand on the back of his neck. He turned around, and of course, there wasn't anybody there. Well, there was another well-known ghost that's here, and that's the ghost of Rufus McCain. This one comes with a pretty cool backstory. Check this out. So Henry Young, Arthur Doc Barker, and Rufus McCain attempted the impossible in January of 1939. These 3 deviants decided that they were going to escape Alcatraz, but it didn't go exactly the way that they had planned it, and Arthur wound up dead because he got shot by a guard. Both Rufus and Henry were sentenced to almost 22 horrific months of solitary confinement with a restricted diet of 2 small meals per day. Once they were both allowed to go back to the normal cells, they were both allocated jobs in separate departments. Well, Henry was working directly above Rufus in the furniture division, and one day he just absolutely loses his shit, grabs a spoon and runs downstairs to the tailoring section where Rufus was, and he stabs him in the neck with the handle. Well, Rufus goes into shock, and he spent 5 hours in a slow and grueling death. It's reported that his old solitary confinement cell, 14D, make a note of that, folks, is freezing cold year-round, and his presence can still be felt there. Rufus is also accused of murder, but they couldn't charge him because he was dead when it went down. You guys are going to love this. So this story goes that a few years after his death, there was this other inmate that was occupying his old cell on D Block. Well, this dude is freaking out because there's some weird shit going on in there, right? Well, there's this one night that he hears something, and he opens his eyes, and he sees this heavy, dark shadow with big, red, glowing eyes standing there in his cell. This poor bastard was terrified. He's locked in the cell with this thing. There ain't no running, and there ain't nowhere to hide. So he screams all night long while he's trying to get away from this evil entity, and the guards just ignored him. Well, the guards found him the next morning with unexplained marks all over his body. His face was purple and his eyes were bulging. That dude was deader than hell. He'd been strangled by some invisible entity, and it was claimed that that was the ghost of Rufus McCain. Now, next up is the Maxwell Street Police Station. So, after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the neighborhood had a massive growth explosion. But with this crazy spike in population, there came another spike along with it in the form of soaring crime rates. Well, the area actually came to be known as the wickedest police district in the world. And at the center of it all was a police station rife with corruption, known for bribery, blackmail, torture, and death. The locals have never been able to shake the atrocities that were rumored to have gone down in the basement, or dungeon as they now call it. Many of the more unruly inmates who were tossed into the rat-infested bowels of this building were never seen or heard from again, at least not while they were alive. Now, the building is now incorporated into the University of Illinois, where visitors have reported hearing the sounds of crying, shrieking, and the rattling metal from lower levels of the building. This next one is a mouthful, so folks, I'm only going to stumble through this once. This is the Pottawatomie County Jail in Iowa. I probably just massacred that, but that's okay. At least you'll recognize it the next time you hear it, I think. Anyway, this little jail is in Iowa, and it dates back to 1885. At the time, it was considered truly unique in its design. I have no idea where they came up with this plan, but check this out. These cell blocks were arranged like a carousel, and they rotated all day and all night long by the way of a water wheel. The design, which is known as the squirrel cage jail, was far from faultless, though. This rotating mechanism jammed up a whole lot, and the gears would sometimes crush the limbs of the inmates. I didn't laugh. Okay, I did. In fact, there was one time when the gears got jammed that an inmate had died, and days went by before they could free the mechanism, so he just laid in his jail cell rotting. I'm sure that was fantastic for his neighboring inmates. Anyway, this one's kind of like Alcatraz too, because come to find out, it was built on top of the old St. Paul's Episcopal Church morgue. That may explain some of the unusual spirits that are sometimes seen there. There's a woman that pops up on occasion, and there's also a little girl that's dressed in gray. Now, with both of these entities comes an overwhelming sense of sorrow. Also making appearances here, several of the past jailers, a guard or two, and of course a plethora of the inmates. Some of them that were murdered or died there, and some that were freed at some point but were just drawn back to the place that they knew best as home while they were alive. Now the next one, the name alone fills you with a sense of dread. The Mansfield Reformatory. That kind of sounds like something from out of a grindhouse flick, doesn't it? I dig it. All right. So this rural Ohio institution was built in 1886. It was known as the Ohio State Reformatory. It was originally designed as a rehab center for young, low to mid-level offenders. And for the first few years, OSR was reforming these inmates by teaching them job skills and giving them some spirituality as well. Yeah, that didn't last for very long. These other surrounding prisons in the area were just overflowing. So at some point, OSR had to start taking on some of the most hardened and nasty criminals in the area. Those cells that had been intended to house 1 man were now home to 3. The whole spirituality and job skill thing went to hell after that. The focus of this facility went from reform to riot control and punishment like 2.2 seconds. Now let's talk about the forms of punishment they used to keep all these badasses in line, right? So the prison was equipped with an antiquated torture device, actually several of them. One of those was the butterfly. There was a form of electro torture, water hose, that's always a crowd favorite, and the sweat box for non-white prisoners. And of course, every prison's got one, the hole, which is a small, dark, solitary confinement cell. So along with the possibility of being tortured by the guards, these inmates were also subjected to some extreme violence from the more volatile inmates. And then, of course, there was the horrific food, the rat and insect infestation, and of course, the lovely viruses that infected everyone, like the plague. So preferential treatment was actually possible in this establishment, but it was only for the inmates that could afford to pay cash. Give me the cash. So as you can guess, there's been quite a few violent deaths there and some non-violent ones as well. And many of those folks are still hanging around that joint today. Let's start with this one. In 1935, Arthur Glatke was appointed as the new superintendent of the establishment. Well, he immediately starts trying to reform and improve the miserable conditions there, but there wasn't a whole lot he could do about the overcrowding thing, and he damn sure couldn't make everybody behave. Well, Glatke and his wife lived in the admin wing. On November the 5th in 1950, Helen was searching in the closet for a box, and she knocked a gun off the shelf. Well, it hit the floor, and of course, it fired, and the bullet was lodged in her chest. Helen managed to live for about 3 days, but she did die later on after suffering some complications from the injury. Now, Glatke was well respected by the prisoners and the community leaders, so he stayed on after Helen's death, at least until he had a fatal heart attack of his own in his office in February of 1959. Well, folks today that visit the jails say that they could smell the rose perfume coming from Helen's pink bathroom. And other folks have reported feeling a rush of cold air pass through them as they walk through that area. It's also not uncommon to hear of a jammed camera shutter, which unexplainably starts working again as soon as the visitor walks away from the area. Hey, Leisha White, how you doing tonight, hon? And then, of course, every prison has one. A lot of folks don't talk about them, but this one just happens to be haunted. It's the chapel. And it's reported to be the scene of many paranormal events. Supposedly, before it became the chapel, it was the spot they used for executions. A lot of people have captured orbs in photographs and recordings of strange and unidentified sounds there. Spirits have been seen hanging out in the doorways, but they always tend to vanish as soon as they're noticed. The infirmary is another hot spot there. Many prisoners died some miserable deaths right there in that little spot. Rumor had it that many of the sick and dying inmates were just abandoned there without treatment because there wasn't anything there that could be done for them. Well, those that didn't die from whatever it was that landed them in the infirmary in the first place actually wound up starving to death because they couldn't defend themselves when the other inmates came to steal their food. Well, there's other spots in the prison as well that has its own forms of activity. One of them you would know off the bat is, of course, the basement. But this is where you're going to encounter one of the unexplained anomalies that occur there. There's a 14-year-old that shows up there. He seems to be peaceful and just kind of shows up and wanders around for a minute before he disappears. However, he's not alone down there. There is a rather sinister guard that hangs out there, and he's been known to curse at, slap, hit, bite, kick, punch. He becomes very violent at times, especially when there's a skeptic that's there investigating that particular little area of the prison. Also in the library, folks have reported seeing the spirit of a young woman. It could be possibly be Helen, but a lot of folks tend to believe that it was a nurse that was killed there by one of the prisoners. Now, the inmates' graveyard is notorious for moving objects and orbs and digital equipment failure. That's pretty common there, too. We know what causes that, right, folks? And then located in the basement, we forgot to talk about the hole. Now, that was like the ultimate punishment for these unruly inmates. These cells were tiny and infested with roaches and rats, and
a lot of paranormal activity has been reported in the 20 whole cells that are there. Folks sometimes report sudden nausea or fever-like chills. And of course, there's also the uncomfortable feeling of being watched while visiting in that area. It's perhaps one of the most creepiest spots in the entire prison. One more, maybe two more, we'll see. This is the Charleston jail, or the old Charleston jail, that's said to have been made famous because it housed America's first female serial killer. Take notes, folks. Her name was Lavinia Fisher, and of course her husband was there with her. Now this jail is packed with the spirits of other inmates, runaway slaves, and old Civil War soldier ghosts. There's ghostly voices and spectral figures and slamming doors that have all been reported there since it closed in 1939. Some folks have even been lucky enough to see the ghost of Lavinia Fisher. They say she roams around the old Charleston muttering the devil to anybody who'll listen. Well, you know, I've got to tell you Lavina's legend, right? So, okay. They say that Lavina had a way with men, and most particularly her husband, John. She had homeboy wrapped. John and Lavina ran this little inn that they called the 6 Mile House, and of course it was located 6 miles away from Charleston. So a lot of folks that were traveling in and out of town would stop there for a hot meal and or a room before they moved forward. Well, a lot of those folks got a whole lot more than what they ever bargained for. Lavina loved to bring men into her parlor for tea and conversation, particularly the wealthy ones. She had a taste for gold, right? So the rich ones, they all wound up with a little something extra in their tea, a lethal dose of poison. So when this drug started to kick in, Lavina and John would help the suddenly exhausted traveler up to the best bedroom upstairs. Well, once he was out cold, John would spring this lever and the floor would collapse beneath the bed. Interesting to wake up to, right? The person that was in the bed would then crash into a pit that was beneath the subfloor of the house. And if the poison or the fall didn't kill him, John was standing right there to finish him off. And then he'd relieve the corpse of all its valuables, raise the trap door, and then go dispose of the body. Pretty flawless, right? Well, one evening, this dude named John Peoples stopped over. So Lavina takes him to her parlor and she offers him tea. Well, Peoples didn't really care for tea, but he was a nice guy. So when Lavina turned her back, he dumped the tea over his shoulder into a nearby plant. So over the course of the conversation, Lavina starts giving Peoples a weird feeling because she's expecting the dude to fall out any minute. Well, he's noticing that the husband keeps kind of walking back and forth, and he's kind of hanging around outside the door. So Mr. Peoples starts getting a little nervous, and he's ready to get away from this couple. So he claims that he was tired and made excuses and found his way up to his bedroom. So he's glad to be away from the Fishers, but he wasn't quite ready for bed yet. So he sits down in a chair that's nearby to the door, and he starts to read. Well, a little while later, the bed collapses, and he looks up and he sees this pit in the floor down below the foot of the bed. So he jumps up and he freaks out, and he goes to open the door and run away, and there's a very shocked John Fisher standing next to Lavina, and they didn't know what the hell to do because this dude's supposed to be unconscious, not running out the door, right? So Peoples is freaking the hell out. He slams the door and bolts out the window, and he runs all the way to Charleston, where he reported what happened to the police, who, of course, opened a full-scale investigation. Well, they start finding bodies of numerous victims, and, of course, tons of missing people were identified in the cellar of the Fisher home. Lavina and her husband, John, were sentenced to be hung, so they were sent to Charleston's old jail to await the executioner. Well, since they were married, they were kept in an upper-level room together, from which they nearly escaped at some point. John, as a matter of fact, actually made it outside of the jail, but Lavina couldn't get her ass out. So loyal John allowed himself to be recaptured so he could die hanging next to his wife. But in South Carolina at that time, married women automatically escaped the death penalty. So Lavina hoped that she was going to escape the gallows by default. Well, the judge quashed that quick, fast, and in a hurry. He told her that he'd hang her husband first, which would make her a widow, and she'd be eligible for hanging. So John mounted the gallows peacefully enough, but his loyalty to Lavinia broke when he suddenly proclaimed his innocence, and then he asked for forgiveness for his crimes. Well, that was it for John. The story says that Lavinia wore a wedding dress to her hanging. She was hoping that her beauty and pitifulness would cause some man in the crowd to suddenly feel drawn to marry her at the last moment and save her life. Well, when old girl realized that that wasn't going to happen, she got pissed. They had to drag her ass up to the gallows, kicking and screaming. Here's a first-hand account according to one of the town's historians at the time. I'm being told to wake up. I am awake, Jimmy. I don't know what's happening. So anyway.
4 minutes over.
Wow, really? Okay. Well, go ahead and cut off, and I'm going to finish telling the Facebook folks about Lavinia Fisher. So anyway, this guy says she stamped in rage and swore with all her vehemence of her amazing vocabulary, calling down damnation. The crowd stood shocked into silence while she cut short one curse with another and ended in a volley of shrieks. Yeah, that's what we call road rage around here. Right, folks? Anyway, Lavina made one last statement. You ready for this? Lavina shouts out to the crowd, "If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me and I'll carry it straight to the devil himself." And then she jumped from the platform on her own, breaking her neck immediately. Well, Lavina Fisher and her husband were buried in Potter's Field near the old jail. This is a good spot to go looking for her because she hangs out there still today. Other folks have seen and experienced some crazy shit in her cell at the old jail, including sightings of her apparition looking from outside of her window. All right, folks. So that's about it for me. I'm wrapping it up. And apparently I've already been wrapped up on ARM Radio because I went over We'll Blame It on the Line tonight. So you guys keep it creepy. Meet back up with me right here on ARM Radio, TuneIn Satellite, and of course Facebook Live next Monday evening, 7 Central, 8 Eastern. Y'all come get your scary on.
User left